Diffusion of innovations is a theory about how technology and social status help spread the communication of new ideas. It's a complex system of different variables that's almost always changing, and this is a large reason why it's still a theory. While the concept was first studied and proposed in Europe during the 1800s, it gained a large amount of traction in 1962 when Everett Roger, a sociology professor at Ohio State University, published his research on it. To kinda too long didn't read this, as well as butcher the entire theory, it involves an innovation, subjects called adopters, the communication networks that adopters use, the social systems and influences the adopters have over one another, and finally the amount of time it takes for the innovation to reach
complete global saturation.
The theory is mostly applied to commercial goods or social concepts, but you can use it with competitive gaming as well. It does a decent job of explaining how meta works as well as how players interact with each other. Gaming communities make fine test subjects for innovation evaluation, so let's break down the force of will community with it. I find the social and psychological aspects of games almost as interesting and fun as playing them. I also have a couple of other videos planned around the psychological and social aspects of games, and I feel like this is a great foundation to build all of those off of. Diffusion of innovations breaks adopters down into 5 categories: innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. At first glance, you might think the order of these categories relates to skill level in games, but it doesn't. Skill really isn't a factor in the building blocks of diffusion of innovation since it's all about social status. You can have someone who is an innovator that has never topped a major event. Likewise, you can have someone in the late majority that has amazing game sense, but doesn't have the skill set required to be an innovator or early adopter. So, who are innovators? According to my lackadaisical Wikipedia research, innovators are risk takers. They are the first to adopt new technology and often have high social status or monetary wealth. They typically take risks because the backlash from a failed risk doesn't hurt them as much as it would others. In a card game, your innovators would be your brewers and deck builders. These are the people who constantly shuffle through new ideas and, more often than not, are the ones who come up with whatever the next big twist in competitive play is. But not always. See, the player who first proposed the green-black favor build that topped at a lot of majors during the beginning of 2018 is just as much of an innovator as the guy who took mono-black musketeers to your locals. The difference here is that the saturation rate for green-black favor took off, while your friend at locals had to potentially reevaluate his deck choices. Innovators tend to make up a very small part of a community, though, which will make more sense once we break down the other types of adopters. Speaking of, early adopters. Early adopters are defined as individuals with strong leadership skills. Or, in our case, I guess they'd be people with boisterous opinions. They choose to adopt an idea they see from an innovator after carefully calculating if the investment is worth it, and then find ways to refine and maximize its value. I know I said before that skill has little to do with these categories, but early adopters are the one exception. Early adopters in card games are your top players. Of the professional teams in the US and EU, many of them have 1 or 2 innovators, with the rest of the players being early adopters. So basically you have your one guy who comes up with an idea, and then the rest of the team tests it, alters it, and finds the optimal way to use it. Communication between innovators and early adopters is important, and since all these players hang out in the same secret clubhouse, they tend to only deal with a few ideas at a time. This is why top 8 lists in the US tend to be boring to look at. All the early adopters will work from the same innovation. This past meta is actually a really good example of this. Sherry has had a variety of different builds that can be used with many different colors, but the English-speaking community seemed to mostly huddle around one specific build that was optimized, rather than waste resources looking at other options. Early adopters tend to have a lot of sway on what does and doesn't become successful, or in our case, what people end up playing or complaining about online. The majority is split into 2 halves, the early and late majority. Early majority adopters are people of high social status or wealth that lack the leadership or social pressure skills of early adopters. In Force of Will, these are invested competitive players that lack teams or social outlets like websites or YouTube channels. They keep up to date with the game and read and research deck lists, and then take those lists to potentially find their own success with them. There's also the opportunity for these players to be potential innovators if they try to brew around whatever the current meta is. However, since they lack the groups of early adopters that more successful innovators have, their ideas might not end up as optimized or successful. Late majority is where I would argue that most of this game's community falls, at least in North America. Late majority subjects are typically skeptics, and adopt ideas later than the average person. This concept doesn't work out exceptionally well in terms of gaming, but these would be the players who keep up with the meta but don't actually go to events. They lack the experience or knowledge that early adopters and early majority have because they don't go out and experience competitive environments. In other words, they will often see the Scheherazade, but they couldn't tell you why she's strong outside of saying, oh, well, she's in top 8. Laggards are the absolute last people to pick up on an idea of technology. In normal terms, this is your grandpa. In Force of Will terms, these are your players who are so far separated from the game that the meta literally doesn't matter. They either are denied access to information or simply don't care, typically more of the latter. In a more popular game like Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh!, these would be the kids who buy cards because they like the TV show and have no investment in the actual competitive scene. Force of Will's laggard amount should actually be very small since there isn't too much of an opportunity to know this game exists without also having some kind of investment in the competitive community. Alright, we've got our categories of people and have them defined. Now let's lay them all out. The proposed normal diffusion graph has everything broken into a nice, even parabellum. Parabolum? Parabellum? But fuck it, parabellum. The majority tends to be split in half down the middle, with your laggards being an equal percentage to your innovators and early adopters. However, I feel like if we were to try and graph out Force of Will's player base, we would have something more like this. There are way more innovators in this game, and honestly in most card games, than you would expect compared to the norm. This is because you have a lot of people who like to brew things, but they either aren't highly competitive, lack a group of early adopters to help them optimize, or their innovations just flat out suck. Like I said, this is normal, even if it looks weird. Where things actually do start to get weird on this graph start in the early majority, mostly because Force of Will doesn't really have one. I'm kind of guessing here since we don't really have a good way to track the current player numbers, but I'll be generous and say we have maybe 5,000 total players in North America. My definition of player here means either going to major events, going to local events, buying product, or having product but you either don't have the desire to play or no real place to actually play. If early majority players are the ones who go to major events but don't consistently top, then that means we actually have a very small early majority with a humongous late majority and probably a larger group of laggards than I'd like to admit. So what does this all mean? Well, it explains a lot. The reasons our metas tend to stagnate is because our groups of successful innovators and early adopters are all the same. We can once again look at the sharing meta for a good example of what I'm talking about. Like I said before, there are multiple ways to build her, with some having advantage over others in various ways. But seeing that type of experimentation was rare since everyone believed the same single deck to be the dominating one. When your early majority all sees the same deck topping, they just copy that and the stream continues into the late majority, who don't actively play the game outside their local bubble and then later go online and complain that everything is the same. Side note here, I'm not saying that complaining is bad. When the company screws something up, they need to know. Community voice is important, even if you don't see its effects all the time immediately. But that's a video for another month. Even the "this game is dead" garbage can be broken down and understood when looking at a graph of how our player base is split. So few people actually go to major events, and we have a lot of the same people topping, mostly because these same people are the only ones willing to travel any amount of distance over an hour to play. Our two majorities see this, calculate the game must be dead, and that makes it harder for people to actually get invested. You see, when someone joins a card game, they actively join as either late majority or laggard. Their influences about what or where to play comes less from the influential members of the community and more from what they see out of the early or late majority. So if the majority is constantly posting about how they can't find people to play against, doesn't go to events, and scares away new players with their posts, then everything just becomes a big self-fulfilling prophecy of negativity.